Hey everyone, tonight we're starting with something a bit less math-focused, but possibly more practical, especially if you ever lose access to electricity, running water, or modern plumbing, medieval survival techniques. Before settling in, consider liking the video and subscribing if you truly enjoy this content. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always intriguing to see who's tuning in around the world, maybe while stockpiling beans. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some ambient noise, and let's ease into tonight's exploration. Back in the medieval era, fire wasn't just a convenience, it was essential. It provided heat, light, cooking ability, safety, and could be your only companion during a week-long storm in a thatched hut. So when people left home, they didn't just bring food, they brought fire. This came in the form of a portable fire bundle, the medieval equivalent of a lighter, albeit slower, sheep-scented, and potentially disastrous if mishandled. Here's how it worked. You'd take a hot coal, usually charcoal from your hearth, wrap it in dried moss, fungus, or punk wood, and place it into a hollowed-out horn or a fire-resistant leather pouch. Sometimes it was wrapped in linen soaked with saltpeter or animal fat to help it smolder longer. The ember could stay lit for hours, even a full day, and be rekindled with some breath and gentle effort, much like your confidence after dealing with taxes. This bundle was light, reusable, and essential. It spared you the agony of trying to spark a fire from flint and steel in the cold, which was difficult if your tinder was damp or your hands were frozen stiff. Having fire ready meant you could stop anywhere, set up shelter, unwrap your moss-wrapped ember, and with a breath and a little hope, get flames going for warmth, cooking, or storytelling by shadow puppet. You could even lend one to a neighbor headed to market, literally passing the torch, because no one wanted to be the person begging for fire at sunset. That came with the shameful reply, "Should have brought your moss, Gerald." Modern prepper pantries might look like vaults of ambition, jerky, beans, sketchy old canned goods, and enough freeze-dried meals to outlast a minor apocalypse. But medieval folks preserved meat the old way, using smoke, salt, and the gnawing fear of starvation come February. These days, smoking meat is often linked with barbecues, beers, and cooking pride. But in medieval times, smoking meat wasn't about flavor, it was about survival. And the smoke used wasn't just any smoke, it was subtle and concealed. In many cottages with open hearths, meat wasn't hung visibly over the fire like you'd see in fantasy movies. Instead, it was hidden behind the flames, high up in the rafters, out of reach from animals, kids, and that nosy neighbor who always showed up at dinner time. Why behind the fire? Because that's where the cool smoke moved, slowly, steadily, rising through the house and curling around whatever unlucky piece of chicken or pork you had. Over days, weeks, even months, the smoke would dry the meat, kill bacteria, keep bugs away, and make sure your ham lasted longer than your New Year's resolutions. This wasn't the sweet-smelling applewood barbecue kind of smoke. This was pine smoke, thick and bitter, soaked in hardship and full of personality. After a few months, the meat became tough, dark, and completely protected from rot, insects, and uninvited relatives. Even better, meat hidden in smoke was harder to steal, which mattered in villages where "I didn't see your sausage hanging there" could count as a legal excuse. Plus, there was a bonus. While the meat smoked, the house stayed warm and pest-free. Nothing quite captured the cozy medieval vibe like sitting under a smoky ham, wrapped in warmth and hope. Modern folks love perimeter defenses, motion sensors, tripwires, surveillance drones, and that one guy who swears his dog can detect looters from a mile off. But medieval people had their own way of guarding property. No batteries barking or Wi-Fi required. It was called a living fence, and yes, it was exactly what it sounds like. Imagine keeping your cows in and your neighbor's kids out without wood, nails, or shouting. The answer: grow your fence. These living barriers, also known as hedgerows, were formed by planting fast-growing flexible trees like willow, hawthorn, hazel, or blackthorn close together. Instead of letting them grow straight up, you'd bend, weave, and tangle the branches into a thick, wild barrier that could stop a pig, steer a goose, and absolutely ruin a thief's day. They were both effective and fierce in a beautifully spiky way. Some were made by partially cutting the trunks and bending them sideways, encouraging new growth. Others used thorny plants that served as burglar deterrents and free sources of berries, assuming you had the pain tolerance for harvesting them. The best part: living fences got stronger over time. Unlike wood fences that rot and fall apart, hedgerows grew denser and tougher each year. Medieval farmers weren't just putting up barriers, they were raising fortresses. They also did double duty. Birds nested in them, pollinators thrived on them, and they helped stop soil erosion. Basically, they were the medieval version of a Swiss Army knife, if it came with thorns, bees, and the occasional hidden ferret. Plus, they were beautiful. Some hedgerows still standing in England today are over 700 years old, older than wars, monarchies, and multiple Brexit attempts. When you hear clay battery, you might picture monks in pointy hats, shocking frogs with static, or medieval villagers accidentally inventing the Tesla. But actually, this type of battery wasn't about electricity. It was all about temperature control, long before thermostats, mini fridges, or anyone worried about climate change. Clay isn't just for pots, odd sculptures, or preschool crafts. In medieval times, it was secretly brilliant at thermal mass. Basically, it could hold on to heat or cold, much like a stubborn grandmother holds on to grudges. Here's how it worked. Medieval homes and food storage areas often used clay-lined walls or containers to manage temperature. In summer, clay kept food cooler than the air. In winter, it held heat longer than most materials. It wasn't magic, just physics with mud. People stored milk, butter, or stew in unglazed clay pots soaked in water. As the water evaporated from the porous clay, it cooled the contents, essentially a medieval fridge that was cheaper, quieter, and didn't make your food taste weird. Some even buried these pots in cellars or shaded pits, where the steady underground temperature helped preserve food and drinks, and maybe Grandma's secret apple pie. Clay could also be heated near fires and then used to slowly release warmth through the night. People put heated clay bricks in beds under blankets, or wrapped them in wool and carried them on carts. It was basically the medieval version of a hot water bottle, but made of earth. And unlike today's batteries, these didn't explode, they just cracked when they failed. If you've ever cursed a pan for making your eggs stick, you probably appreciate Teflon. But in the Middle Ages, long before non-stick coatings and TV infomercials, people had something much simpler and much more likely to give you blisters, called friction glaze. Medieval cooks polished their cookware by hand to create a smooth, semi-resistant surface that reduced sticking. It wasn't perfect, but it worked surprisingly well, especially if your standards were already low from a lifetime of cabbage-heavy meals. Here's how they did it. Pots were typically made from coarse clay, which was about as non-stick as sandpaper. By rubbing the damp pots with smooth stones, bone tools, or hard wood, they compressed the surface, aligned the particles, and sealed the pores. This slow, careful polishing created a subtle shine called burnished glaze. Imagine someone spending half a day massaging a soup pot like it owed them money. That's friction glaze. Did it stop everything from sticking? Not completely. It wasn't a miracle, but it cut down on food, sticking enough to make cleaning easier and stew a bit less crusty. Some even coated their polished pots with a thin layer of animal fat and then fired them, creating an early version of seasoning to further seal the surface. It also made the pots more durable by protecting them from water and cracking. As a bonus, burnished pots looked better. In a world filled with dull colors, wood, and decay, a shiny pot was basically the medieval version of kitchen luxury. Of course, the method took a lot of effort and probably left many potters with chronic shoulder pain, but it was the difference between having functional cookware and a pot that turned your porridge into cement. Today, people might spend hundreds on high-tech cookware like titanium or the latest non-stick trend. Back then, people just picked up a rock and rubbed until the pot cooperated. It might seem primitive, but it worked. Long before GPS, Google Maps, or that overconfident friend with terrible shortcuts, people navigated using sound, especially in foggy forests or on those misty mornings where you couldn't even see your cartwheel. This was the lost art of sound-based navigation, not some superhero power or bat-style echolocation, but practical survival through careful listening. And honestly, our ancestors deserve more credit. These were folks who could tell where they were just from the way a church bell rang or how many dogs were barking. If you were traveling on foot with no compass or landmarks, just fog, mud, and a growing fear of going in circles, you'd listen for sounds. Bells from churches, cowbells, or even gongs in some areas acted like sound-based lighthouses. Towns rang their bells not just for religious services, but to let people know that civilization was nearby. Herd animals wore bells too, not just so they could be found if they wandered, but so you could follow the sounds home. As long as you didn't follow the wrong herd and wind up in someone else's pasture. Some forests and mountain passes had wind chimes, clanging pots, or drums hung in trees to help mark the path. A noise on the wind meant you were heading the right way, or at least down a trail someone else had used and maybe survived. Fishermen used horns and echoes to find harbor entrances. Travelers would shout, clap, or bang sticks to gauge distance by how long it took the sound to echo back. Basically, primitive sonar, no wetsuit required. Even taverns helped, with music or loud chatter, spilling into the street like a beacon of beer-soaked safety. Just follow the sound and you'd find warmth, food, and maybe your cousin passed out under a bench. If you lived in the Middle Ages and wanted to avoid losing your teeth too early, you relied on charcoal, not toothpaste or floss, just burnt stuff. Medieval people didn't have Colgate. They used charred wood ground into powder, often mixed with salt, dried herbs, or crushed shells, and rubbed it on their teeth using fingers, sticks, or a twig wrapped with a rag if you were trying to be fancy. This gritty mix acted like a tooth scrub, polishing enamel, scraping off food buildup, and, if luck was on your side, delaying total dental disaster until your 40s. Was it pleasant? Not even close. Rubbing gritty ash on your teeth felt exactly like you'd imagine, like chewing sand at a bonfire. How did medieval potters reduce shoulder strain? What other medieval navigation sounds were used? Can you detail medieval dental health practices? It was still better than the alternative, letting plaque run wild until your gums rebelled painfully. Charcoal had mild antibacterial effects, so it helped with bad breath, sort of. In medieval terms, fresh breath meant being able to talk to someone within 3 feet without making them cry. Some remedies included mint, rosemary, or sage, not because they worked well, but to give the impression of cleanliness. Others recommended rinsing with vinegar afterward, which probably cancelled out any benefit from the charcoal and added the bonus of melting your enamel. If things got worse, dental care involved pliers, strong hands, and absolutely no anesthesia. So yeah, rubbing ashes on your teeth suddenly seemed like the best option. Today, charcoal has made a comeback in trendy toothpaste and spa products, but make no mistake, back then people used it because the only other option was having their teeth yanked out by a guy named Bartholomew, who also doubled as a knife sharpener. Let's be real, modern homes are mostly drywall, concrete, and IKEA furniture that collapses if you breathe on it wrong, but medieval peasants built houses out of sticks, mud, straw, and pure determination. The method was called wattle and daub, which sounds like a quirky folk band, but was actually the foundation of survival architecture. Here's how it worked. First, you start with wattle, a fancy term for woven branches, twigs, or bendy sticks. Imagine basket weaving, but taller, colder, and far more likely to fall on your goat. These wattle panels were tied between wooden posts, forming the skeleton of what looked like a confused fence. Then came the daub, a delightful hand-mixed blend of mud, straw, clay, and animal dung. Yes, dung, because in the Middle Ages, if it didn't involve poop, were you even trying? This sticky mixture was smeared onto the wattle and left to dry, creating a surprisingly sturdy, insulated wall. It kept the wind out, trapped warmth, and gave off that earthy scent that said, "Home sweet, slightly composting home." It wasn't glamorous. The walls could crack, crumble, or attract overly curious chickens, and fixing them was just part of your weekly chores, somewhere between "don't starve" and "yell at the neighbor's goat." But it was cheap, practical, and 100% locally sourced. No shipping costs, no carbon footprint, just mud, sweat, and maybe a bit of emotional scarring. Despite how primitive it sounds, wattle and daub walls could last decades, sometimes even centuries, with upkeep. In fact, some medieval homes, still standing today, have their original wattle walls, meaning a random peasant in 1350 did a better job than your last contractor. Now imagine medieval bedtime, a lumpy straw mattress stuffed with disappointment, a leaky thatched roof dripping something questionable, and the ever-present risk of fleas, lice, and other tiny horrors that bite, crawl, or buzz with way too much confidence. The solution? Herb-stuffed bedding, a clever mix of aromatherapy and pest control. Not born out of luxury, but because no one wanted to wake up as an all-you-can-eat buffet for parasites. Stuffing your mattress with plain straw was basically sending out an open invitation for bugs. The itchy, twitchy, blood-sucking kind. So instead, smart households used strong-smelling herbs like lavender, mint, wormwood, pennyroyal, and rosemary, not for luxury, but as protection. These herbs acted as medieval insect repellent. Their pungent aromas kept fleas, lice, and mosquitoes away, and sometimes even spouses. Some, like tansy or rue, were even believed to ward off evil spirits. Conveniently, they also discouraged meddling in-laws. The result was a bed that smelled like a strangely nice salad and kept bugs at bay for a few nights, after which you'd have to replace the herbs or risk being clawed awake by an angry tick. And it wasn't just mattresses. Herbs were scattered across floors, woven into doorways and hung over beds. Basically, if you could stick a sprig of wormwood into it, you did. Homes ended up looking like eerie herbal shops, but they were cleaner, safer, and definitely smelled better than the neighbour's goat shed. Before bug nets and DEET, this was genius. Entire guides existed detailing the best herbs. Some folks even believed lavender made your dreams sweeter. The science is questionable, but if it helped you forget the leaky ceiling and that your pillow was just a sack of oats, it was a blessing. Long before humming fridges and glowing freezer drawers full of forgotten peas, medieval people had to be inventive to stop food from turning into a science project. That's where passive preservation came in. Stone cooling shelves, also called slab shelves, larders, or more simply, that cold rock you put the cheese on, were the solution. Here's how it worked. Thick stone slabs, often slate or marble if you were wealthy, were built into the shaded north-facing walls of homes where sunlight rarely reached. These stones absorbed the Earth's naturally cooler temperatures and created a chilled zone, a kind of medieval mini-fridge, but quieter and with more spiders. During colder months, they kept milk, butter, meat, and leftovers from spoiling too fast. Even in warmer weather, the stone stayed cooler than the air due to its thermal mass. Basically, stone doesn't care how hot it gets outside. No cords, no motors, no glowing bulb judging your late-night snacking, just rock, shade, and hope. Some homes even had entire stone pantries or cool rooms with thick walls and dirt floors, the ancestors of modern root cellars. These were built as far from the kitchen fire as possible because while medieval folks liked hot soup, they didn't want it warming up their butter. Wealthier homes might even enhance the cooling effect with damp cloths or porous jars filled with evaporating water. Which herbs were most effective, repelling bugs? How did stone shelves maintain cool temperatures? What herbs were believed to keep away demons? Why was the meat smoked behind the fire? Because that's where the cool smoke slowly drifted upward, winding through the house and enveloping whatever piece of chicken or pig you managed to get. Over days, weeks, or even months, the smoke would dry the meat, kill bacteria, repel insects, and preserve it far longer than your New Year's resolutions ever lasted. This wasn't the sweet applewood barbecue kind of smoke. It was thick, acrid smoke from pine wood, full of grit and character. After a few months, the meat would become tough, dark, and completely resistant to rot, pests, and surprise visits from relatives. Plus, meat hidden in smoke took longer to cook and was harder to steal. Important in a village where claiming "I didn't see your sausage" could be used as a legal excuse. And don't forget the added bonus: while the meat smoked, it kept the house warm and bug-free. Nothing captures that medieval cozy vibe like sitting under a smoking ham in a room full of smoke and optimism. Today's preppers love perimeter defense, motion sensors, tripwires, drones, and that guy who swears his dog can sniff out looters from a mile away. But medieval people had their own kind of home security, and it didn't need batteries, barking, or Wi-Fi. It was called a living fence. And yes, it was exactly what it sounds like. Imagine needing to keep your cows in and the neighbor's kids out, but you don't have lumber, nails, or the energy to yell. So you grow a wall. Living fences or hedgerows were made by planting fast-growing, flexible trees like willow, hawthorn, hazel, or blackthorn close together. As they grew, you didn't let them shoot straight up. You wove and twisted the branches into a thick, tangled barrier that could stop a pig, turn away a goose, and completely ruin a thief's day. It was both effective and intimidating in a prickly sort of way. Some hedges were laid, meaning their trunks were partially cut and bent sideways to encourage new growth while still alive. Others included thorny plants that worked as burglar deterrents and freeberry bushes if you had the hands of a masochist. The best part? Living fences only got stronger over time. While wooden fences rot and collapse, living hedges thickened, strengthened, and became more impenetrable every year. Medieval farmers weren't just putting up barriers, they were growing fortresses. These fences served many purposes. They provided nesting spots for birds, attracted pollinators, and helped prevent soil erosion. In short, they were medieval Swiss Army knives, if your Swiss Army knife came with thorns, bees, and maybe a hidden ferret. And they were stunning too. Some hedgerows still standing in England today are over 700 years old, outlasting wars, monarchs, and several rounds of Brexit. If you needed more time, you lit another one. If you needed better light, you moved closer. And if your rushlight blew out in a drafty room, well, that was just part of life in medieval darkness. Rushlights weren't only for illumination, they also served as timers. Need to boil something for half the time it takes a rushlight to burn? Easy. Curious how long Gerald takes to get back from the ale house? Light one and start counting. They were cheap, quick to make, and surprisingly eco-friendly, as long as you didn't mind your home smelling a bit like fried pork and swamp water. Today we keep butter in fridges, plastic containers, or even fancy wooden churns if you're really into the vintage farm aesthetic. But in the Middle Ages, without refrigeration, someone took a look at a swamp and decided to store dairy there. Enter bog butter, literally butter or lard buried in a peat bog. Why a bog? Despite being full of muck, bugs, and probably hissing creatures, bogs are cold, low in oxygen, and acidic, nature's unlikely but effective fridge. People wrapped butter in cloth, bark, or barrels and buried it deep in the peat, not for a day, but for months, years, even centuries. Archaeologists in Ireland have uncovered bog butter over 3,000 years old. That's right. An ancient Celtic farmer's forgotten treat is now museum display, not breakfast. The bog's cold, airless conditions stopped bacteria and fungi from spoiling the butter, and the peat's tannins helped keep it from oxidizing. The result, a strangely preserved dairy lump that, according to daring modern tasters, smells like cheese, smoke, and earthy disappointment. Was this your everyday cooking butter? Not likely. It was long-term storage, used for winter supplies, offerings, or that one cousin who always showed up in spring needing food. And bog storage had a bonus: security. Want to keep thieves out? Bury your food in freezing swamp muck. No one's digging there for a snack. If you're picturing medieval homes as cozy cottages with tidy shelves of jam and pickles, think again. Food storage was more about survival than style. One ingenious solution: hollow trees, nature's original pantry. No building required, and they came with natural camouflage. Hollow trees were surprisingly common across the medieval countryside. Whether caused by age, lightning, decay, or overly eager squirrels, hollow trees became makeshift storage spaces for peasants, travelers, and anyone needing a cool spot for perishables. Need to hide cheese, dried meat, or apples away from home? Use a tree. Want to protect your food from a neighbor's goat or the neighbor? Use a tree. Traveling through the forest and need a chilly spot to stash that questionable pheasant you found? Tree. The inside of a hollow tree offered shade, insulation, and natural cover. Its thick bark and enclosed space helped maintain a steady temperature and slow food spoilage. It wasn't suitable for long-term storage, but worked well short-term, especially in cooler seasons. Some lined the interior with leaves, moss, or bark to keep it dry and add a rustic touch. Others used ceramic or leather containers to make it seem less likely that squirrels had nibbled on the contents. These tree hollows didn't just store food, they also hid valuables, weapons, herbal medicines, and even, in emergencies, small children during attacks not as childcare. A good tree could mean the difference between hunger and survival, or at least between cool cheese and suspiciously warm cheese. In survival terms, eating bark usually signals desperation. But in the Middle Ages, bark was actually a real food source. Enter bark bread, a medieval staple that essentially meant, I didn't starve, but I did eat part of a tree. During frequent famines, peasants turned to forests, not for game or mushrooms, which were too seasonal or risky, but for tree bark, specifically the soft inner layer, cambium, of pine, birch, or elm trees. This wasn't the hard outer bark, but the tender, moist layer underneath. It was shaved off, dried, ground into flour, and mixed into dough. Tasty? Number nutritious? Surprisingly, yes, it had fiber, minerals, and complex carbs. It sustained people when grain ran out, taxes loomed, and cows mysteriously stopped producing milk, perhaps in protest. Bark flour was combined with whatever was on hand, acorns, nettles, or real flour if you were lucky, and baked into dense, chewy loaves that looked like bread, but tasted like forest. Faced with bark bread or death, people picked carbs. Some even toasted the bark first to give it a smoky flavor, or at least distract from the fact it was tree. And it wasn't just peasants. During sieges and brutal winters, entire communities depended on bark-based food. They even regulated how much cambium could be harvested to avoid killing the trees. Too much bark, the tree died. Too little, the villager. To them, cleanliness and decoration symbolized civility, divine favor, and even social status. It wasn't just about appearances, it was about preparing to be seen by the gods. Take the eyes, for example. Bold black eyeliner existed long before Cleopatra, flourishing in ancient Sumer. Both men and women used dramatic lines made from coal or a mix of lead, copper, and antimony powder. While this may alarm modern dermatologists, they believed it protected against evil spirits and shielded their eyes from the desert sun. Their skincare routines would astonish today's beauty influencers. They exfoliated and brightened their skin using oils blended with crushed, semi-precious stones. Riverbank mud, rich in minerals, was applied thickly to cool the body, then scraped off once dry, leaving smooth, glowing skin. These were the original clay masks, more ancient science than luxury. Hair removal was another ritual. Using sharpened seashells or primitive tweezers, they plucked, scraped, or burned away body hair. A smooth body was a sign of refinement and spiritual purity. The more flawless your appearance, the closer you were to divine perfection. Even statues of gods and priestesses were hairless, with symmetrical features and large painted eyes. Scent was just as important. Fragrant oils weren't only pleasant, they were sacred. Myrrh, Frankincense and cedar were mixed with animal fats and used like perfume. These scents were believed to cleanse the body and delight the gods. In royal courts, perfumed oils were so prized they were offered as gifts of tribute. Eyebrow tattoos were already a thing. Permanent makeup didn't begin in the 20th century. It was practiced in ancient temples. Women used soot or natural dyes to ink bold arches that framed their faces, proving that their beauty was a long-term investment. And if you think modern beauty trends are extreme, just look at Cleopatra. More than a seductress, she was the ultimate symbol of the Greco-Roman obsession with beauty. Though her face appeared on coins, her influence extended to every apothecary and boudoir from Alexandria to Rome. And she wasn't alone. Roman women adopted Egypt's love for luxury and took it even further. Take the famous milk bath. Cleopatra supposedly bathed daily in donkey milk. Whether that meant 500 donkeys or just gossip, one fact remains. Lactic acid in sour milk is a natural exfoliant. The Romans eagerly followed suit. Wealthy women bathed in milk, honey, and rose petals, believing it smoothed wrinkles and brightened skin. It worked, just not for your bank account. Moving on to the face, Roman women prized pale, almost ghostly skin, a sign of wealth that meant avoiding the sun. They used ceruza, a white, lead-based face powder. It was toxic but gave a flawless matte look. Women applied it thickly, especially on the cheeks and forehead. Over time it caused sores, hair loss, and sometimes death. But achieving goddess-like beauty was considered worth it. Rouge and lip stains came from red ochre, crushed beetles, or mulberry juice. Bright lips and cheeks were seen as youthful and alluring. For eyeliner and brows they used soot mixed with animal fat. Sparse brows, no problem. Draw them on or even tattoo them, as in Mesopotamia. Hair was another front in the beauty war. Roman women styled their hair into complex curls using heated metal rods well before curling irons. They dyed it with herbs, ash, or fermented leeches for that trendy blonde look. Wigs made from the hair of German slaves were status symbols among elite Roman women. And then there was perfume, an empire of its own. Romans were obsessed with fragrance. Oils infused with saffron, cinnamon, and roses were massaged into every fold of the body. Bathhouses smelled like botanical gardens drenched in musk. In contrast, ancient Chinese beauty was less showy and more philosophical. While Rome pursued glamour, Chinese aesthetics valued balance, harmony, and inner energy, but subtlety did not mean simplicity. The beauty routines in dynastic China were equally elaborate, spiritually rooted, and at times surprisingly intense. It began with the skin. Fair, porcelain-like complexions were admired, not due to fear of sunlight, but because pale skin signified nobility and a life of leisure, while peasant women toiled under the sun, noble women stayed indoors, carefully maintaining their skin like treasured artifacts. White lead powder, crushed pearls, and rice powder were common ingredients, not just for cosmetics, but also for medicinal purposes. Many beauty formulas were crafted by royal physicians, believed to enhance vital energy or extend life. The centerpiece of ancient Chinese skincare was jade. Centuries before jade rollers became popular online, Han Dynasty women used them. Jade, cool and linked to immortality, was rolled over the face to improve blood flow, reduce puffiness, and preserve youthfulness. Even emperors used jade pillows, believing they drew out skin toxins during sleep. Eyebrows held great importance. Women shaped and painted them based on fashion trends, political influences. Some eras favored long, sweeping brows, others preferred short, upward strokes. Ink from burnt willow or charcoal was applied using rabbit hair brushes. Certain styles even called for removing natural brows and redrawing them higher on the forehead for a celestial look. Lips were coloured with a mixture of cinnabar and animal fat, occasionally blended with beeswax. Cheeks were touched with safflower petal rouge in small circles. Beauty marks weren't accidental. Tiny black dots near the eyes or lips were intentionally drawn as symbols of allure and mystery. Hair care was a daily commitment. Women cleansed their hair with fermented rice water and nourished it with camellia oil, often growing it to great lengths. Intricate hairstyles held by jade pins and gold combs were more than fashionable. They signified status, refinement, and elegance. To the ancient Chinese, beauty wasn't loud or deadly. It was reflective, disciplined, and symbolic. It expressed quiet strength and artistic restraint, seen in the luminous skin and the perfect arch of a brow. If beauty ever truly became lethal, that moment belonged to the Renaissance. In the royal courts of Italy, England, and France, women weren't just trying to look more attractive. They were slowly poisoning themselves in the quest for beauty. Their aim was to achieve flawless, pale white skin with vibrant red lips and elegantly arched brows. To do this, they used chemical concoctions that would horrify modern skincare experts. The most notorious was Venetian ceruse, a lavish face paste made from white lead and vinegar. It created a smooth, stark white complexion that concealed imperfections and wrinkles. Queen Elizabeth I famously used it. Under candlelight, it made the skin appear radiant and porcelain-like. But the price was severe: skin damage, paralysis, tooth loss, and eventually death. It was a slow, lethal beauty practice during the Renaissance. Arsenic was another tool for those seeking a lighter skin tone or to fade freckles. Arsenic wafers were marketed as miracle products believed to give skin a translucent glow. However, they also caused vomiting, kidney failure, and internal bleeding. Yet beauty was pursued at any cost, even health. Women shaped their eyebrows into thin arches or removed them entirely. A high, rounded forehead was trendy, so women often shaved their hairlines to create the illusion of a larger brain and, by extension, higher intellect and virtue. Balding was considered a mark of status. Blush was made from crushed berries, cochineal insects, or vermilion. Lips were coloured with similar mixtures, some containing mercury-based dyes that provided a bold red hue but caused permanent nerve damage. Flushed cheeks symbolized youth and vitality, highly valued in an era where life expectancy was short. Strong, sweet fragrances made from ambergris, musk, and civet were worn not just for attraction, but to hide the smell of poor hygiene beneath layers of toxic makeup. Bathing was still met with suspicion in many European regions. Golden hair was highly desirable, particularly in Italy. Women bleached their hair with mixtures of sulfur, soda, and lemon juice, then sat in the sun wearing hats with the tops cut out to expose only their hair. While effective, this practice severely damaged their scalps. Long before the modern obsession with natural skincare, ancient India had already perfected the concept through Ayurveda, the science of life. Indian beauty practices were not isolated routines, but part of a holistic approach to health and well-being. They were expressions of spiritual health, diet, and internal harmony. Outer beauty reflected your doshas, the elemental forces within. It began with bathing, a sacred act. Women during the Vedic era bathed in water infused with turmeric or milk, then exfoliated with upan, a paste made of chickpea flour, sandalwood, turmeric, milk, and rosewater. This mixture brightened the skin, slowed aging, and cleansed energy. There were no artificial chemicals, just natural, kitchen-sourced ingredients that also served as healing remedies. Hair was seen as a crown of beauty. Oils warmed and infused with coconut, amla, Indian gooseberry, and hibiscus were massaged into the scalp to encourage growth, soothe the mind, and prevent early graying. Long, thick hair was more than attractive. It symbolized health and femininity. Hair oiling was a communal, meditative practice. Kajal, the black eyeliner still popular in India, had spiritual origins. Made from soot and ghee, it was believed to guard against the evil eye. Mothers applied it not only to themselves but also to their babies for protection. Fragrance held deep meaning. Cities like Kannauj became famous for making attars, perfumes from flowers like jasmine, rose, and vetiver. These oils were applied to the body, hair, and bath water, intended not just to allure, but to bring spiritual focus. Scents helped connect the senses with the divine. Natural tints for lips and cheeks came from beetroot, saffron, and rose petals. Teeth were cleaned with neem sticks and charcoal long before plastic brushes, with oral care linked to moon phases and dochic rhythms. One of the most distinctive practices was mendi, henna used to decorate hands and feet, especially during weddings. Henna wasn't just decorative, it cooled the body, reduced stress, and symbolized happiness, fertility, and transformation. Every design held meaning. Ancient Greeks also valued beauty, but not in the flashy way of later empires. For them, beauty was tied to morality. A well-shaped body or symmetrical face signified a virtuous soul. It represented inner balance, intellect, and divine blessing. So it's no surprise that in classical Greece, personal grooming was seen almost as a civic responsibility. Let's start with the skin. Like the Romans, the Greeks admired pale skin. A fair complexion signified nobility and a life of leisure, while a tan indicated outdoor labor associated with slaves and the lower class. To achieve this pale look, Greek women applied powders made from white lead, chalk, or crushed seashells. These powders were far from subtle. Some women layered them so heavily that the makeup would crack when they smiled. Beauty required sacrifice. For red lips and cheeks, they used mulberries, red iron oxide, or wine sediment. The deeper the red, the more attractive the appearance, though it had to be applied sparingly. Excessive makeup was disapproved of. A slight blush indicated good health and purity. Too much suggested ties to prostitutes, known as hetairai, who used bold rouge and ornate cosmetics to captivate philosophers and politicians. Hair care was taken seriously. Greek women valued long, wavy hair styled in braids, buns, or knots, held in place with ivory or bronze pins. To lighten their hair, they applied vinegar, lemon juice, or even ashes. Blonde hair was especially admired, seen as exotic and divine. Think Helen of Troy. Among the wealthy, wigs and extensions made from the hair of enslaved northern women were common. Eyebrows were important. A unibrow was considered a mark of purity and wisdom. Women who didn't naturally have one would use powdered antimony or soot to draw it in. Some even glued goat hair between their brows to achieve that soft, intellectual appearance. Perfumes were carefully crafted using olive oil as a base mixed with herbs like marjoram, thyme, and iris root. They were used after bathing, which the Greeks did frequently, often in communal baths. Cleanliness was literally a form of devotion. In the forests and mountains of Mesoamerica, beauty took a different form. It was anything but delicate. For the Aztecs and Mayans, beauty was striking, a clear expression of identity, authority, and sacred responsibility. The ideal body was shaped, sculpted, and sometimes painfully transformed to honor the gods and display social status. One of the most extreme forms of this was cranial modification. Among the Mayans and Aztecs, reshaping a baby's skull was considered a way to enhance appearance. From infancy, wooden boards were strapped to a child's head to stretch the skull into a sloped, cone-like form. This represented nobility, intelligence, and beauty. The smoother and longer the forehead, the higher the person's status. Next, dental decoration. Instead of whitening treatments, Mayan elites adorned their teeth with jade, turquoise, and hematite. Small holes were drilled using obsidian tools, and gemstones were set in place with natural adhesives. Their smiles literally sparkled, and enduring the procedure required incredible pain tolerance. Filed teeth were also fashionable, shaped into sharp points or symmetrical designs to imitate animal features, symbolizing power or a divine connection. Face and body painting were essential for daily life and rituals. Aztec women often wore red and yellow pigments on their cheeks, while both genders used black paint during ceremonies. These colors had symbolic meanings. Red represented life and fertility. Black stood for war or religious devotion. Some paints came from crushed insects like cochineal, producing a vivid crimson color. Piercings and tattoos held spiritual significance. Ear, nose, and lip piercings were common, often decorated with jade or bone ornaments. Tattoos made with thorns and ink expressed a person's family heritage, religious status, or battle achievements. These were not subtle embellishments, but bold declarations of loyalty to gods like Quetzalcoatl or Ixchel. Even crossed eyes were considered attractive among the Maya. Mothers would dangle beads in front of their infants' noses to train their eyes to misalign. This wasn't viewed as a flaw, but as a sign of mystical perception. Across ancient Africa's vast landscape, its beauty was as varied as the environment. From the fertile Nile Valley to Nubia's savannas and the trade centers of West Africa, beauty practices were both functional and deeply symbolic. Adornment went beyond fashion. It reflected identity, status, and cosmic harmony. Let's dive in. In ancient Egypt, where beauty was treated almost like a science, both men and women applied kohl around their eyes not only to enhance their appearance, but also for protection. The dark pigment, made from galena or lead sulfide, helped reduce the sun's glare and prevent infections. The extended eye lines created the iconic, almond-shaped look seen in Egyptian art. Eyes were considered sacred, not just expressions of the soul, but spiritual channels to the divine. Perfume was both a luxury and a necessity. Egyptians adored fragrance so much they invented perfume cones, wax cones infused with myrrh, cinnamon, and lotus oil worn on the head during ceremonies. As they melted from body heat, they released scent that coated the hair and skin. Daily hygiene involved the use of scented oils after bathing, often stored in beautifully crafted stone or alabaster containers. Skincare was essential not only for beauty but also for surviving the harsh climate. Oils like palm, shea butter, and castor oil protected against sun and dryness. These oils had medicinal uses too, healing wounds, soothing rashes, and preserving skin radiance. Body scrubs made from sand or crushed seeds kept the skin clean and exfoliated long before modern tools like loofahs existed. In Nubia, hair was a key aspect of identity. Intricate braids and shaved designs conveyed messages about tribe, age, and marital status. Hair was often dyed with henna and adorned with beads, shells, or gold thread. A tall, styled hairstyle wasn't just stylish, it was a symbol of royalty. In ancient Yoruba or Songhai lands further west, body painting with indigo and ochre pigments played a role in rituals and celebrations. Tribal markings, whether scarred or painted, were considered enhancements of beauty and expressions of strength and cultural heritage. Beauty always came at a cost: time, effort, wealth. But in ancient times, it could also endanger health, mental well-being, and even life. Throughout civilizations, the quest for beauty sometimes veered into dangerous territory. While admired and even revered, these rituals often left more than cosmetic scars. Harmful substances like lead, arsenic, mercury, and crushed insects were commonly used in makeup and skincare. These shared one trait: toxicity. Lead-based face powders used in ancient Rome, Greece, and later Renaissance Europe caused hair loss, muscle weakness, and gradual organ failure. Still, pale skin was seen as a mark of beauty and status, a deadly compliment. In ancient China, elite women bound their feet from a young age to achieve the so-called lotus foot, a beauty ideal that symbolized grace and obedience. Imagine it as an ancient version of tarot mixed with competitive backgammon. The royal game of wasn't limited to temples or palaces. It's been discovered in places as distant as India and Egypt, suggesting it spread through trade routes and captivated diverse civilizations. Long before chess or checkers existed, it might have been the first truly global board game. For the ancient Sumerians, playing it wasn't just about passing time, it was a way to engage with fate, seek divine approval, and perhaps uncover the universe's hidden order. It was a game, but also a ritual, a race, and a rehearsal for the afterlife. Senet wasn't merely a board game, it was a spiritual passport. Played as early as 3100 BCE, Senet appears in tomb paintings, writings, and even in the hands of pharaohs like Tutankhamun. To the ancient Egyptians, it wasn't just entertainment, it was a symbolic journey of the soul through the underworld, where each move could have eternal significance. The board had 30 squares arranged in 3 rows of 10. Players had 5 or 7 pieces and aimed to move them across and off the board. Movement was decided by throwing sticks or bones, acting as early dice. But it wasn't just about luck. Strategy and timing were vital. By the New Kingdom period, around 1550 BCE, Senet had become more than a household game. It represented the soul's path through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. Specific squares symbolized stages like rebirth, judgment, danger, and purification. Every turn became a spiritual act invoking divine forces. The game's imagery became more mystical. Some boards had hieroglyphs depicting protective gods or spells. Square 26 often stood for the House of Rebirth, while Square 27 was the House of Happiness. Landing there could mean divine favor, while others signified setbacks or threats. The board became a spiritual map, crafted from cedar and paint. Senet was also deeply connected to the goddess Maat, who represented truth, justice, and cosmic balance. Imagine it as ancient tarot combined with a competitive board game. The royal game wasn't only played in temples or royal courts. Versions have been discovered in places like India and Egypt, indicating it traveled along trade routes and fascinated many cultures. It may have been the world's first truly global board game, long before chess or checkers existed. For the ancient Sumerians, playing the royal game wasn't just a way to pass the time. It was a confrontation with fate, a test of divine favor, and perhaps a glimpse into the hidden order of the universe. It was both a game and a ritual, a race, and a symbolic rehearsal for eternity. The game of Senet wasn't merely entertainment, it was considered a pathway to the afterlife. Played as early as 3100 BCE, Senet appears in tomb art, literature, and even on the laps of pharaohs like Tutankhamun. For ancient Egyptians, Senet represented more than leisure. It symbolized the soul's journey through the underworld, with every move potentially resonating through eternity. The Senet board had 30 squares arranged in 3 rows of 10. Each player had 5 or 7 pieces, and the goal was to move them across the board and off the final square. Movement was determined by casting sticks or bones, functioning like primitive dice. But winning required more than luck. Strategy and timing were crucial. Over time, especially by the New Kingdom period around 1550 BCE, Senet evolved into something far deeper than a simple pastime. It became a ritual dramatization of the soul's voyage through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. Certain squares on the board symbolized key phases of this journey: rebirth, judgment, danger, purification. Each turn wasn't just chance, it invoked divine forces. Senet boards became decorated with mystical symbols, including hieroglyphs for protective deities and spells. For instance, square 26 often symbolized the house of rebirth, while square 27 represented the house of happiness. Landing on these squares could grant divine protection, while others could bring delay or harm. The board became a miniature version of the afterlife, a spiritual obstacle course crafted from wood and paint. Senet was also connected to the goddess Maat, who personified truth, justice, and universal balance. Playing the game of Senet in ancient Egypt was more than entertainment. It symbolized the soul's journey through the afterlife, where it would be judged against the feather of Maat. Winning could mean eternal life. Losing might require a few extra protective charms in your tomb. Though it resembled backgammon, Senet was part game, part spiritual guide, and part religious practice. Egyptians didn't just play it, they prayed through it. To the casual observer, knucklebone seemed like a simple children's game, just bones tossed into the air. But in ancient Greece it was much more, a blend of skill, luck, flirtation, and divine symbolism. In noisy city markets or quiet temple courtyards, the bones clattered on stone floors, echoing with laughter, competition, and ceremony. The game used small ankle bones from sheep or goats called astragaloi. Unlike modern dice, these 4-sided bones rolled unpredictably, adding excitement. Players tossed them and aimed to catch or land them in specific positions to score. The rules differed across time and place, but the thrill was universal. Adults, especially women, loved it. Art often shows young girls in fine robes playing with intense focus. Knucklebones was a blend of grace and skill, like an ancient fidget toy that also served as a social ritual. Sometimes it was used in flirtation. A skillful throw could draw a suitor's attention. But the game also held deeper meaning. Each bone side had a name and a number, making it useful for both play and divination. A favorable throw might be seen as a divine message, perhaps from Apollo or Hermes. Landing 4 identical sides, called the Venus throw, was considered a divine blessing. The game also connected to death and the afterlife. Knuckle bones were placed in graves, seen as toys or divination tools for the next world. Some believed spirits played through them or used them to foresee the future, or Over time, the materials changed. Greeks began making knuckle bones from bronze, glass, and ivory, but the fascination endured. Do you like this personality? Before Senet became dominant in ancient Egypt, there was Mayhem, a mysterious spiral-shaped board game named after a protective serpent god. Mayhem wasn't just for entertainment, it blended mythology, strategy, and ritual. Though its exact rules have been lost over time, the remaining boards and pieces suggest it had deep symbolic meaning. The board resembled a coiled serpent, with rectangular spaces spiraling inward toward the head. The serpent represented Mayhem, who was believed to guard the sun god Ra during his nightly journey through the underworld. So each game symbolized a divine voyage, where players navigated trials of danger, change, and rebirth. Game pieces found include small lion-shaped tokens and spherical marbles. Scholars think players move marbles through the serpent's coils, possibly aided or hindered by the lion figures, which may have served as protectors, obstacles, or even rival attackers. Though we don't know exactly how the game was played, it likely used dice or casting sticks like other Egyptian games. What's striking is how quickly Mayhem vanished. It was popular during the Old Kingdom, around 2600 to 2300 BCE, but disappeared by the Middle Kingdom, no one knows why. Some think its religious meaning became outdated, while others believe it was replaced by Senet's rising ceremonial importance. Mayhem became a relic, leaving behind only serpent-shaped boards and silent lion pieces. Interestingly, similar spiral boards have turned up in Cyprus and the Levant, indicating that the game, or at least its design, spread via trade or conquest. Whether it kept its original symbolic value or became just a puzzle abroad remains unknown. But the mystery enhances its allure. Mayhem was more than a game. It was a journey along a divine serpent spine, symbolizing protection, peril, and the endless cycle of life and death. Playing it meant stepping into a myth-laden spiral. Long before the Vikings penned sagas or carved runestones, they played Tafel, a group of unevenly matched board games that reflected their harsh world of raids, battles, and survival. From frozen homesteads in Norway to bustling ports in Ireland, Tafel games spread across the Norse realm, sharpening minds as well as blades. These were not peaceful games. Tafel distilled warfare into strategy, deception, and high-stakes decisions. The best-known version is Nefertafel, or King's Table, played on a square grid of varying sizes, most commonly 11 by 11 or 13 by 13. The game's defining feature was its asymmetry. Before Senet ruled ancient Egypt, there was Mayhem, an enigmatic spiral-shaped board game named after a serpent god known for protection. Mayhem was not merely entertainment. It combined mythology, strategy, and ritual. Though the exact gameplay has been lost to history, the remaining boards and pieces suggest it symbolized more than simple amusement. It embodied cosmic meaning in motion. The board itself resembled a coiled serpent divided into rectangular spaces, spiraling inward toward its head. This serpent, Mayhem, was believed to guard the sun god Ra during his nightly journey through the underworld, turning each game into a reenactment of that divine voyage, with players navigating danger, change, and renewal. Artifacts found with the boards include small, lion-shaped tokens and round marbles or spheres. It's thought that each player controlled marbles traveling along the serpent's body, possibly protected or hindered by the lion figures, which may have acted as guardians, obstacles, or rivals. Though the movement mechanics are uncertain, they probably involved dice or casting sticks, similar to other Egyptian games. What makes Mayhem especially intriguing is its sudden disappearance. It was popular during Egypt's Old Kingdom, around 2600 to 2300 BCE, but vanished from records and archaeological sites by the Middle Kingdom. The reasons remain unknown. Perhaps its religious significance declined, or Senet's growing role in funerary rituals eclipsed it. Either way, Mayhem faded, leaving behind only its ornate serpent-shaped boards and silent lion pieces. Interestingly, similar spiral boards have been found in Cyprus and the Levant, indicating that the game, or at least its imagery, spread through trade or conquest. Whether it kept its symbolic meaning abroad or became a mere puzzle remains unclear, but this only deepens its mystery. Ultimately, Mayhem was more than a game. It was a symbolic journey along the serpent's spine, reflecting protection, risk, and the endless cycle of life and death. Playing it meant stepping into a spiral where every move carried mythological weight. Long before Vikings carved runestones or composed sagas, they played Tafel, a group of asymmetric board games reflecting their harsh world of raids, sieges, and survival. From icy Norwegian homes to bustling Irish ports, Tafel games spread across the Norse realm, sharpening minds alongside swords. These were no harmless diversions. Tafel was warfare simplified into strategy, deception, and risk-taking. The most renowned version is Tafel, or King's Table, played on a square grid of varying sizes, most commonly 11 by 11 or 13 by 13. Its defining feature was asymmetry. One player leads a king and a few defenders stationed at the center of the board, while the other commands a larger force of attackers positioned around the edges. The king's objective is to escape to a corner square, while the attackers aim to trap the king by surrounding him on all four sides. There are no dice involved, only pure strategy, foresight, and tactical positioning. Much like Viking raids, the game is unbalanced. The attackers outnumber the defenders 2-1. This forces the player controlling the king to adopt the mindset of a resourceful leader, constantly dodging, deceiving, and outsmarting the opponent. Tafel boards were commonly made from wood, antler, or stone, featuring detailed grid designs and ornamental pieces. Wealthy warriors sometimes owned more elaborate sets, made from glass or bone, with pieces shaped like kings, warriors, or dragons. Designed for portability, these boards were ideal for long sea journeys, and although rules varied by region, the core theme was constant: conflict. More than just a game, Tafel served as training for Viking leadership and ambush tactics. It taught players when to fall back, when to make sacrifices, and how to think strategically in uncertain situations. In a world where alliances shifted quickly, the ability to anticipate an enemy's move could be the key to survival or triumph. Tafel was so deeply rooted in Norse society that Christian missionaries even used it to connect with pagan communities, sometimes swapping the king piece for a bishop. However, as chess spread across Scandinavia in the medieval era, Tafel declined in popularity and was nearly forgotten by the 12th century, though traces of it remain in local games like Tablet. At its height, Tafel wasn't merely a pastime, it was a Viking battlefield, quieter, neater, and fought with carved bone instead of real blood. Meanwhile, in the grand courts of ancient India, among sacred rituals, elephants, and incense, another game was played, not just for enjoyment, but for destiny. Pachisi, considered India's national game, was far more than a casual activity. It represented the interplay of karma, rulership, and strategic risk. With roots tracing back to at least the 6th century CE, it was especially beloved by emperors like Akbar the Great, who didn't just play it, he embodied it. The board was shaped like a large cross, symbolizing the 4 directions and the meeting point of fate. Each arm formed a path of squares leading to a central throne, or home square. Players moved 4 pieces around the board, aiming to get all of them to the center before their rivals, but instead. Some spaces on the board carried negative meanings. Landing on them meant losing progress or possessions. And yes, possessions, because Patali wasn't just for fun, it was a serious gambling event. Players wagered items like food, blankets, gold dust, jade, and even slaves. High-stakes matches were intense, with crowds cheering or booing, and priests sometimes overseeing the game to ensure it remained fair and spiritually proper. Before major games, players offered tributes to McQuilks, asking for luck or forgiveness in case of defeat. Playing Poli meant risking not just wealth, but divine disapproval. When the Spanish arrived, they were appalled, viewing Pole as a gateway to sin and paganism. They banned gambling and destroyed the boards. Still, the game lived on, remembered in secret, or transformed into safer versions. What set Patti apart wasn't just its gameplay, but its mix of chance, strategy, and spiritual symbolism. The board was a miniature cosmos. Each move represented a twist of fate, and every match echoed the eternal struggle between order and chaos, life and loss. Today, games are typically seen as leisure, ways to relax, compete, or pass the time. But in ancient times, games were sacred. They weren't mere entertainment. They were reflections of the universe, training grounds for leaders, and symbolic rehearsals for death, destiny, and rebirth. Across ancient cultures, from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, games were rituals in disguise. Take Senet and Patti, for example. These weren't just hobbies, they held religious significance, often played in temples, tombs, or ceremonial spaces. Senet boards were discovered in the tombs of Egyptian pharaohs, not as playthings but as tools to help guide the soul through the underworld, or dua. Winning wasn't about beating an opponent, it was about showing you were spiritually ready for the afterlife. Similarly, in the Aztec world, Patti was played under the watchful eye of the gods, Maquilo-Chit, the god of games and indulgence, demanded offerings and reverence. The throw of beans wasn't just luck, it was divine messaging, signs of blessing or punishment. Losing your possessions could be interpreted as karmic balance. Some spaces on the board brought penalties, symbolizing bad omens, where landing meant losing progress or possessions. And by possessions, it meant real stakes. Patoli wasn't just played for fun, it was a serious gambling event. Players wagered everything from food and blankets to gold dust, jade, even slaves. High-stakes games could get heated, drawing crowds of spectators who cheered or heckled, while priests sometimes monitored the matches to maintain fairness and spiritual respect. Before important games, players made offerings to Maquilxochitl, asking for good fortune or forgiveness in case of defeat. Playing Patoli risked more than wealth, it risked divine disapproval. When the Spanish arrived, they were appalled. They viewed Patoli as promoting vice and pagan practices. Gambling was banned, boards destroyed. Yet the game survived, passed down in secret, or evolving into safer versions. What set Patoli apart wasn't just its rules, but how it blended chance, strategy, and spiritual belief. The board represented a miniature cosmos. Each roll of the dice symbolized fate, and each game reflected the timeless struggle between order and chaos, life and loss. Today we often see games as leisure, a way to relax, compete, or pass time. But in ancient cultures, games were sacred. They weren't just entertainment, they mirrored the universe, trained leaders, and prepared people for death, destiny, and rebirth. Across civilizations from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, games carried deep meaning. Consider Senet and Patoli. These weren't simple diversions, they were infused with spiritual significance, often played in temples, tombs, or during ceremonies. Senet boards were buried with Egyptian pharaohs, not as toys, but as tools to help the soul navigate the duat, the underworld. Winning Senet wasn't about beating an opponent, it was about proving one's readiness for the afterlife. Similarly, among the Aztecs, Patoli was played under divine observation. Maquilxochitl, the god of games and excess, demanded offerings and devotion. The toss of beans wasn't mere luck. It was a message from the gods, a sign of favor or punishment. Losing your wealth could be seen as deserved spiritual retribution. Winning was seen as a brief harmony with the cosmos. Even abstract games like Mayhem and Patchy carried deep symbolism. Mayhem depicted the serpent god wrapped around Ra, the sun god, during his nightly underworld journey. Each move on the board representing safety, progress, or danger. Pachisi, with its cross-shaped design, was more than just a race to the center. It symbolized dharma, karma, and moksha, the entire spiritual journey told through shells and tokens. Games also played a vital role in education and military training. Ludus latrunculorum and tafel weren't mere pastimes for soldiers, they were tactical exercises. Emperors, generals, and young nobles played them to sharpen their minds, anticipate moves, respond to threats, and balance force with strategy. Games created leaders quietly, far from the battlefield. Whether played in temples, recited in courts, or etched into stone, ancient games had many functions. They entertained, but also educated, healed, judged, and prepared. They linked humans to gods, players to destiny, and the present to eternity. In the ancient world, playing a game wasn't an escape, it was a deeper immersion in life. Mary Wollstonecraft. Godwin was born on August 30th, 1797, under immense expectations. Her birth took place in a time of intellectual upheaval. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, a bold feminist work demanding education and equality for women. Her father, William Godwin, was a philosopher and novelist who opposed monarchy, organized religion, and traditional marriage. Together they were one of Enlightenment England's most radical couples. Just 11 days after Mary's birth, her mother died. Mary's life began with both brilliance and sorrow. Raised by her father in a home full of books, ideas, and revolutionary visitors, she grew up in the shadow of a mother she never knew, but whose presence was felt through her writing. Her father didn't hide these works. He encouraged Mary to read them. Her education was far from ordinary. She learned Greek myths, science, poetry, philosophy, and history before most children could write a paragraph. Her garden was her classroom, and her mind was shaped by thinkers like Cage, Rousseau, and Voltaire. But the household was far from idyllic. William Godwin eventually remarried, and Mary's relationship with her stepmother, Mary Jane Clairmont, was distant and full of tension. The new Mrs. Godwin favoured her own children and saw Mary as a moody and rebellious girl with an overactive imagination. Mary, in turn, resented the domestic expectations forced upon her and found comfort only in writing and daydreaming. By the age of 10, she was already crafting her own stories. By 14, she was reading books that most adults would avoid. She wasn't made for embroidery and tea. She was a gathering storm. Mary's upbringing, shaped by the ideals of political revolution, personal freedom, and feminist defiance, set the stage for a life unlike any other. Her origins were marked by loss, defined by brilliance, and forged through struggle. She wasn't merely the daughter of her famous parents, she was becoming something stranger and far more powerful. Mary Shelley, the future mother of science fiction. In the summer of 1814, 16-year-old Mary Godwin sparked a scandal that rocked literary London. She ran away, not alone, but with the already married passionate poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, who was 5 years older and both a devoted admirer and a bitter disappointment to her father. What began as a rebellious love story soon unraveled into sorrow, exile, and creative fire. Mary first met Percy in her father's home, where he often came to discuss philosophy and honour Godwin's works. But it was Mary, not her father, who captivated him. Quiet and intense, she shared Percy's passions for liberty, science, and the supernatural. They read together at her mother's grave in St. Pancras churchyard, where Mary often went to feel close to the woman she never knew. Among tombstones and candlelit books, their romance began. Their escape was sudden and impulsive. Mary, Percy, and her stepsister Claire Clairmont fled England for France with little more than the clothes they wore and no clear plan. Percy left behind his pregnant wife, Harriet, a decision that would haunt them all. The trio wandered through revolutionary France and Switzerland on foot, writing by day and sleeping in flea-ridden inns at night. Their money quickly vanished, and they returned to England in shame. What followed was a period of intense hardship. Percy's creditors pursued them relentlessly. Mary's father, once an advocate of free love, turned his back on her. Then the children began to die. Mary gave birth to a daughter who lived only a few weeks. The household was far from ideal. William Godwin remarried, and Mary's relationship with her stepmother, Mary Jane Clairmont, was distant and full of tension. The new Mrs. Godwin favoured her own children and saw Mary as a rebellious, overly imaginative girl. Mary, in turn, resented the domestic roles expected of her and found comfort only in writing and daydreaming. By the age of 10, she was already crafting her own stories, and by 14, she was reading books that most adults avoided. She wasn't suited for sewing and tea parties. She was a quiet, storm-building power. Raised with ideals of revolution, freedom, and feminist defiance, Mary's childhood set the stage for an extraordinary life. Her beginnings were shadowed by death, defined by brilliance, and hardened by struggle. She was destined to be more than just her parents' child. She was becoming something more mysterious and powerful. Mary Shelley, the future creator of science fiction. In the summer of 1814, at just 16, Mary Godwin ignited a scandal in London's literary circles by running away, not alone, but with the married, idealistic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, 5 years her senior, who both admired and disappointed her father. What started as a rebellious romance soon descended into sorrow, exile, and creative awakening. Mary met Percy at her father's home, where the poet often visited to discuss philosophy and honour Godwin's work. But it was Mary, not her father, who captivated him. Quiet but passionate, she shared Percy's love of freedom, science, and the supernatural. They spent time together reading at her mother's grave in St. Pancras churchyard, where Mary often went to feel close to the mother she never knew. Their love blossomed among tombstones and candle-lit books. Their escape was impulsive and chaotic. Mary, Percy, and Mary's stepsister, Claire Clairmont, left England for France with little more than the clothes on their backs and no real plan. Percy abandoned his pregnant wife, Harriet, a choice that would haunt them all. The trio travelled on foot through revolutionary France and Switzerland, writing by day and sleeping in run-down inns at night. Their money quickly vanished and they returned to England in disgrace. Hardship followed them. Percy faced relentless debt collectors. Mary's father disowned her despite his former advocacy for free love, and tragedy struck their family. Mary gave birth to a daughter who died within weeks. In weeks. This is how Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, was born. The novel was more than just horror. It was a blend of science, mythology, and deep personal grief. Victor Frankenstein's drive to create life reflected the era's obsession with scientific advancement. The rejected and unloved creature symbolized Mary Shelley's own experiences of abandonment and feeling like an outsider. Themes of parenthood, loneliness, and guilt filled every page, drawn from her personal losses and the tumultuous men in her life. When the book was published in 1818, it was released anonymously. Many believed Percy Shelley had written it. He wrote the preface, was her husband, and a man. But the truth came out. Mary Shelley would be recognized not just as a poet's wife, but as the mother of science fiction. In one summer, she channeled lightning, death, and grief into a monster that would live forever. But Mary Shelley's life after Frankenstein didn't follow a path of literary success. It descended into deeper sorrow. Death had always loomed near, and after 1818 it closed in even more. While her novel gained attention, her family began to disappear. She and Percy returned to England only to be struck by more tragedy. Their young children, Clara and William, both died, Clara from dysentery in Italy and William from malaria soon after. Mary was shattered. She had lost 3 children in 3 years. The grief was overwhelming. She wrote, "I am not now in a state to be comforted." She withdrew, haunted by nightmares, and her health declined. Yet a faint light broke through the darkness. In 1819, she gave birth to Percy Florence Shelley, her only surviving child. He became her anchor in the difficult years ahead, but even he couldn't protect her from more tragedy. In 1822, Percy Shelley died suddenly, drowning in a storm while sailing off the Italian coast. His body washed up on shore, unrecognizable except for a copy of Keats's poetry found in his pocket. Mary was only 24, widowed, penniless, and devastated. She had already endured the deaths of 3 of her children, her half-sister Fanny's suicide, the suicide of Percy's estranged wife Harriet, and now the drowning of the man she loved most. It was a real-life Gothic tragedy beyond any fiction. Yet Mary survived. She gathered what was left of Percy, both physically and through his writings. She preserved his poetry, his reputation, and is even said to have kept a piece of his calcified heart wrapped in silk in her desk. Grief became her constant companion and her source of inspiration. Despite everything she kept writing, her pen became her lifeline. She wrote Valperga, a historical novel, and The Last Man, a post-apocalyptic tale of plague and isolation that eerily echoed her own despair. She also edited and published Percy's works to ensure his legacy lived on. Mary didn't just survive her tragedies, she transformed them into art. Love had shaped her early life, but now loss defined her story. By the mid-1820s, Mary Shelley was alone in a way few young women of her time could comprehend. At just 28, she had buried almost everyone she loved, her parents, her children, her half-sister, her husband. All that remained were her pen, her son, Percy Florence, and the heavy burden of legacy. She was no longer the rebellious teenager who had run away from England for love. Now she was a widow, a single mother surrounded by the ghosts of her past. Yet she carried on. Financially insecure, Mary depended on her writing to survive. But Victorian society was unforgiving to women with such a complicated past. She wasn't only judged as a female writer, but also as the scandalous widow of a controversial poet. Publishers wanted her to seem respectable and proper. So, Mary learned to navigate the literary world carefully, balancing her radical history with the need to create a stable life for her son. She worked tirelessly, producing novels like Perkin Warbeck, Lodore, and Faulkner, all exploring themes of political exile, lost mothers, and moral dilemmas. These works weren't as groundbreaking as Frankenstein, but they reflected her changing outlook, less idealistic, more realistic, and deeply introspective. She also wrote biographies, travel narratives, and undertook numerous editorial projects, including the significant task of preserving and promoting Percy's poetry. She shaped his legacy with the same dedication she once devoted to crafting her own stories. His body was found washed up on the shore, unidentifiable except for a book of Keats's poetry in his pocket. Mary was only 24, widowed, penniless, and emotionally broken. She had already endured the deaths of 3 children, the suicides of her half-sister Fanny, and Percy's first wife Harriet, and now the drowning of the man she loved most. It was a real-life Gothic tragedy beyond imagination. Still, Mary pressed on. She gathered Percy's remains, both physical and poetic, preserving his writings, his legacy, and even, allegedly, a piece of his calcified heart wrapped in silk kept in her desk. Grief didn't just accompany her, it became her constant inspiration. Through all this, she continued to write. Her pen became her anchor. She wrote Valperga, a historical novel, and The Last Man, a post-apocalyptic tale of plague and isolation that hauntingly echoed her own loneliness. She also edited and published Percy's works to keep his memory alive. Mary Shelley didn't just live through heartbreak, she transformed it into art. Love had once defined her, but now loss shaped her legacy. By the mid-1820s, Mary Shelley was alone in a way few young women of her time could imagine. At just 28, she had already buried nearly everyone she loved, her parents, her children, her half-sister, her husband. What she had left was her son, Percy Florence, her writing, and the heavy burden of legacy. No longer the rebellious teenager who had run off for love, she was now a widow, a single mother, and a woman haunted by memory. Yet she survived. Financially insecure, Mary depended on her writing to get by. But Victorian society was unkind to women with too much life experience. She faced judgment not just as a woman author, but as the notorious wife of a controversial poet. Publishers wanted her to appear proper and acceptable, so she carefully navigated the literary world, balancing her radical past with the need to provide stability for her son. She wrote diligently, novels like Perkin Warbeck, Lodore and Faulkner, exploring political exile, lost motherhood, and ethical dilemmas. While not as groundbreaking as Frankenstein, these works reflected a more mature, realistic, and introspective voice. She also wrote biographies, travel books, and took on major editorial projects, most importantly, curating and promoting Percy Shelley's poetry. She tended to his legacy with the same devotion she once gave to her fiction. Today, scholars recognize her as the mother of science fiction, not because she set out to claim that role, but because of her groundbreaking creativity. She channeled the fears of her time about science, morality, motherhood, and death into a powerful and enduring story. While editing Percy's works and navigating a publishing world dominated by men, Mary quietly shaped the thoughts of future generations. Her writing delved into politics, feminism, ecological catastrophe, existential fear, and ethical limits. Her 1826 novel, The Last Man, depicted a world devastated by plague and isolation, a vision that would only be fully understood 100 years later. Despite being ill for much of her later life, she never stopped engaging with the world through her words. Her influence had already begun, spreading from the lab to the stage, the press, and into the fabric of modern culture. Mary Shelley had given life to an idea that would never die. And with that, literature was forever changed. Mary Shelley's life was marked not just by love and loss, but by her ongoing struggle with identity. An identity she had to constantly defend, reshape, and hold on to. Being a woman writer in the 19th century was itself a political act. Being Mary Shelley, the daughter of revolutionaries, the widow of a radical poet, and the creator of a morally ambiguous monster, made her existence even more charged. After Percy's death, Mary found herself in a vulnerable position. Though she had legally taken his name through marriage, her claim to be his literary executor and guardian of his legacy was uncertain. His aristocratic family had never accepted her. They distrusted her, deemed her dangerous, and gave her a small allowance only if she kept her distance from their affairs. She was allowed to raise her son, but under strict conditions. Mary navigated this carefully, presenting a public image that was modest, literary, and maternal, while quietly safeguarding her revolutionary roots. When editing Percy's poetry and memoirs, she toned down his atheism and radical politics to ensure his work would appeal to a more conservative Victorian audience. Scholars have long debated whether this was a betrayal or a calculated move. Perhaps it was both. Mary understood the power of reputation better than most. Even as she fought to preserve Percy's legacy, she was also carving out her own. Publishers wanted her to be quiet, invisible, or simply a side note to her husband's fame. But Mary resisted. She kept writing novels under her own name at a time when most women still used male aliases. She insisted on being seen. At the same time, she embedded political messages in her work. In Lodore and Faulkner, she examined women's independence, flawed paternal figures, and the constraints society placed on women. In The Last Man, she portrayed the fall of civilization and the emptiness of empire, clear political critiques. Mary Shelley's pen was more than a tool for storytelling. It was her weapon. Through her novels, biographies, and subtle editorial efforts, she helped shape both the memory of an era and the foundations of modern literature. As the Victorian age flourished, Mary Shelley entered her final decade with quiet grace, though burdened by physical decline and emotional solitude. She was still acknowledged for her intellect and literary achievements, but the world once filled with radical ideas and romantic ideals was disappearing, leaving Mary as one of its last surviving witnesses. The bright lights of her youth, Byron, Percy, Clare, and even her father, William Godwin, were all gone. The revolutionary spirit of the early 1800s had given way to the more restrained tone of the Victorian period. Mary became increasingly isolated, plagued by chronic illness, severe headaches, partial paralysis in her arms, and possibly a recurring brain tumour. Despite this, she rarely complained, absorbing her pain into daily life as naturally as ink soaks into paper. Her devotion to her son, Percy Florence Shelley, remained unwavering. He had grown into a kind and attractive young man who chose a traditional path, eventually inheriting the baronetcy denied to his father. Mary relied deeply on his presence, dedicating her remaining strength to supporting his future and shielding him from the lingering scandals of the Shelley legacy. Although her most daring creative period had passed, Mary continued to work. She kept in touch with publishers, friends, and fellow thinkers, and read widely, delving into history, science, and political theory, remaining mentally active even as her body weakened. She edited Percy's writings, carefully shaping his poetic legacy, while avoiding his more controversial pieces to protect his public image. Yet the emotional weight never fully lifted. She lived simply, often close to poverty, and never remarried. For Mary, marriage had meant passion and shared ideals, not comfort or stability. No one else could replace Percy in her life, and she never allowed anyone to try. In 1851, at 53, Mary Shelley died, most likely from a brain tumour. She passed away peacefully with her son and daughter-in-law by her side. After her death, they discovered among her possessions locks of hair from her deceased children, and what was believed to be a piece of Percy Shelley's heart wrapped in silk. Even in death, Mary remained the guardian of memory, a woman shaped by grief, lifted by brilliance, and compelled to write through the darkest of times. Mary Shelley died in 1851, but her voice endured. In the years that followed, her work, especially Frankenstein, expanded far beyond anything she could have imagined. What began as a ghost story written by a teenage runaway became one of the most influential novels ever written. Mary Shelley was not merely remembered, she was revived over and over. At first, her recognition remained muted. During her life, she was mainly praised for her loyalty to Percy and her role in editing his poetry. Her own novels, though acknowledged, were often overlooked or misunderstood. Frankenstein was once viewed merely as a gothic horror curiosity, with its deeper meanings overlooked by a society unprepared to confront questions of science, morality, and humanity's role in the universe. But over time, Mary Shelley's brilliance became clear. By the 20th century, her creature had become a cultural icon. Films from the silent era to Universal's 1931 Frankenstein starring Boris Karloff gave the monster a new image. It came to represent misunderstood modern fears, a tragic figure born from human pride and rejected by society. Each version mirrored the anxieties of its era: war, technology, nuclear power, artificial intelligence, all infused with Mary's vision. Scholars began reassessing her work with renewed appreciation. Feminist critics recognized her not just as a poet's wife, but as a literary innovator. They explored her reflections on motherhood, loss, creation, and power. Her once neglected novel The Last Man was reappraised as a groundbreaking dystopian work. Her life, full of defiance, intelligence, and resilience, became as compelling as her fiction. Today, Mary Shelley is not merely remembered, she is honored. She's hailed as the mother of science fiction, the queen of Gothic storytelling, and a trailblazer who blended the personal with the philosophical. Her influence endures in education, science, cinema, and politics. Every time we ask what it means to be human or what happens when creation surpasses conscience, we echo her words. She gave us a monster, but through it, she gave voice to every outsider, every radical idea, every curious mind shunned by the world. Mary Shelley didn't just write a book, she transformed literature itself.